Okay, good afternoon, folks. It's lovely to see so many of you. Is that echoing? Is it echoing? No, okay. Okay, I'll proceed. Thanks very, very much for coming along to this evening session. It's wonderful to have you here. I think this is potentially one of the most exciting panel discussions, even plenary discussions. It is echoing? I'll take this off. Just bear with me. Okay, is that better? Right, I'll carry on. So this evening we're going to be talking about whole of government approaches and to indicators and whole of government frameworks. Essentially, it's how do we take all the body of evidence and knowledge that we've got and translate it into operational policy making. And I'm really thrilled with the panel that we've got. These are people who are rolling up their sleeves and trying to turn all the knowledge and the evidence into tangible outcomes through decision making, through budget allocation, through measurement frameworks. So it's absolutely brilliant. This is, in a way, a question, and we've heard a lot about it today, around the sort of changing context of governance in today's world, how expectations of governments are changing, how the economy is more interconnected than ever before, and the capacity of the government, and wherever they are, whatever level of policy making we're talking about, is changing. We've seen perhaps the potential of technology to increase the capacity of government to respond, and at the same time we're seeing cross-border issues such as climate change potentially reducing it. So there's a lot of dynamics pushing back and forth at each other. We've got an absolutely brilliant panel. These are practitioners who know what it's like at the coalface of trying to operationalise some of these very challenging, very tricky questions to make lives better for people and for planet. I'm just going to talk you through a little bit about them now, and then they'll come and speak sequentially, and then hopefully there'll be loads of time for your thoughts and your questions, and we can have a really good dialogue amongst the panels. So first you'll hear from Gary Gillespie, who's the Chief Economic Advisor to the Scottish Government. He's been an academic in his past, working at Strathclyde University as an economist. He, in his current job, produces regular assessments of the state of the Scottish economy. He's a visiting professor at the University of Strathclyde, and he's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences, and he's leading a very exciting project called the Wellbeing Economy Governments, which I think you'll hear about. Then we'll hear from Oliver Chinyanga, who's the director of the African Centre for Statistics at the UN Commission for Africa, based in Addis. He's got a fascinating track record and history working for the African Development Bank, working for the IMF, and as Deputy Director for the Zambian Statistical Office, someone who really knows his mustard when it comes to statistics. We're then going to hear from John Halliwell, probably one of the most eminent thinkers in measuring well-being. John's based at the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia in Canada. He's been Research Fellow for the Canadian Institute for Advanced, for Advanced Research, and he's particularly well known globally for his leading role in the Global Happiness Reports, working with Richard Layard and Jeff Sachs as well. And he's now a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, so it's great to have John here. We're also going to hear from Paula Gadsden, who's Director of the State Government of Morales in Mexico. Paula's got amazing background in various types of economic policy making at various levels in the Mexican government and at state level. She's studied at London School of Economics. She's coordinated the wellbeing agenda in her home state. She's been Undersecretary for Planning. She's worked in social development and as an associate researcher in the National Institute of Public Health. So really diverse background. We're going to learn a lot. And then wonderfully, sadly, Tim Sues from Slovenia was unable to make it. So wonderfully, I'm really delighted we've been able to be joined by Susie Morrissey and Alicia Hawkins from New Zealand, who are going to do a tag team, they assure me. Susie, who's closest to me, is a principal advisor in the Chief Economist's Office in the New Zealand Office of the Treasury. She works on the living standards frameworks, which we've already heard a lot about today, and it's something that the rest of the world can learn from. And hopefully hear a bit more this afternoon about Susie, thank you. And Alicia is the Director of the Office of the Government Statistician, and she's Chief Executive at Statistics New Zealand. She's project executive at Indicators Aotearoa, New Zealand, and measuring progress through wellbeing and a sustainability lens. I'm afraid I've been a bit cruel to our wonderful panellists because not only have I said I'm going to really keep them to 10 minutes, and we've got a timekeeper here in front who's going to ensure that, but I've also added another question to the 3 that our hosts, the OECD, have posed to them. So they've got a big challenge. There's a lot of issues we're going to hopefully unpack and tease out today. But we're going to hear really about why does wellbeing need to be a whole of government agenda. We're going to talk about who should be involved in developing wellbeing frameworks, how metrics are used in policy making. We're going to hear from very practical real life examples and from these governments who are really leading the way in that agenda, and how can successful frameworks be measured. Then, while you're listening to them, please think about the sort of questions you'd like to ask, any advice, any experiences you want to hear, because I'm going to try and open it up as quickly as possible to the audience so that we can have a really, really good dialogue before we head to dinner. I'm going to invite them to speak in turn, and then it'll be over to you. So, Gary, to you first.
Okay, thank you very much, Kathleen. If you don't mind, I'll stand just so I can see you a bit clearer and to enhance my well-being after a long day. I will also speak slowly so the interpreter can translate for those needing to follow my accent. So my name's Gary Gillespie. I'm the Chief Economist from the Scottish Government, and I want to talk to you really about a whole of government indicator that we have in Scotland called the National Performance Framework, and also to give an example of a policy framework that we have in place in relation to inclusive growth, and finally to say a little bit about another group I'm involved in called the Wellbeing Economy Governments. So that's what I'm going to cover in 10 minutes, so I'll do that, and hopefully it'll be interesting for you. So if I can start just with a background slide which shows a measure, the ONS measure of life satisfaction in Scotland, and also relative to GDP. So we heard this morning from the sessions that GDP is a useful measure. It measures output in an economy, but it doesn't relate to people's well-being or life satisfaction. And Scotland, like most other countries, life satisfaction is poorer than GDP. Interestingly, in Scotland, within the UK context, we perform within the UK, that is Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. We are top for life satisfaction, civic engagement, community, but we don't do as well in health. So why are we interested in whole of government frameworks? Well, my job is the Chief Economic Advisor, and we've had a whole of government frameworks in place in Scotland since 2007. This is the current economic strategy for the government, and you'll see that it has 2 pillars. One relating to competitiveness, so we're an outward-looking, small, open economy that's competitive, and the other one's really about tackling inequality. We heard a lot this morning around the difficulty of achieving outcomes when you have inequality in attainment, inequality in opportunity, and we know from the literature how important inequality is in driving outcomes. So the strategy is based on 2 pillars, and the central tenet of the strategy is the words between the arrows. The increasing growth and tackling inequality are mutually supportive. My particular interest is in inclusive growth, and that's the policy framework I'll speak a little bit when we go on. So, as I mentioned, Scotland's part of the UK. We're 8% of the population of the UK, 5.4 million people, and we have 30% of the landmass. We perform well in terms of GDP per capita, where we're at the top of the 3rd quartile of the OECD, but we also have challenges around inequality, both in income, outcome, and particularly health. So this is the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework. This was launched in June earlier this year. We had participation from the UN and also other countries that were interested. So you can look at it and you can either see a petal or a cog. I think the males see it as a cog, females see it as a petal. I don't know if that's true or not. But what we have is we have 11 outcomes and 76 indicators. But I would point you to the centre of the circle, the government's purpose, which essentially has the purpose of the government is to focus on creating a more successful country with opportunities for all of Scotland to flourish through increased well-being and sustainable and inclusive economic growth. So the well-being is central to it. Also, if you look below our purpose, our values, so this picks up in the type of society we want to be, a society that values diversity, treats people with kindness, dignity, and this is really important for Scotland. So governments now are looking beyond GDP and putting whole of government performance frameworks. But one of the challenges behind these frameworks is how you interlink objectives or outcomes for economy with health, with education, with justice. Because the more you look at these systems, you realise that to achieve an outcome requires a whole system approach. So the idea behind most performance frameworks is you set your North Star, your vision for the country, you have a set of outcomes, and across the whole of government and society, you work towards those outcomes. Now, this performance framework was consulted on extensively. It's cross-parliamentary support. And what that means is if there's a change of government, a change of politics, this type of approach to government remains. So it's outcome focused. It's about joining up the different areas. And you'll see from economy outcomes to environmental outcomes to health to justice, this is the basis for the government in Scotland to operate. So my role as Chief Economic Advisor is to think about how better policies in the economy can impact and enhance well-being in Scotland. So that's really my focus in this cog. And I want to give you a very quick example of an inclusive growth framework that we've developed in Scotland. And this framework has been developed to look at place-based economic development. So it's economic development at the sub-Scotland level. And essentially, it's a whole system approach. It looks at data across 5 measures which we believe are important: economic performance, labour market, fair work, people in place. It starts, the first stage is understanding the data. How's the area performing? What's the story behind that area? So we've adapted this approach from work that the World Bank done, which looks at the constraints to inclusive and sustainable growth within areas. You then look at the history of the area. What's the vision and outcome for the particular area? What are the assets that they have within the area? And what are the priorities for the area? Because not every level of government will be able to alleviate some of the outcomes. So you go through the steps from 1, 2, 3, 4, and then essentially you have a delivery of the focus for the area. But the 5th step's really important because that links back up to the national priorities. So this inclusive growth diagnostic is really about driving, if you look at the red box at the top and at the brown box at the bottom, it's about driving better outcomes for growth for all parts of Scotland, and this works in different areas. So this is a policy toolkit. We have it's available online if you want to look at it. We have a website called the Scottish Centre for Regional Inclusive Growth, where you can look at these frameworks and their applications, and it's data-based and it's not top-down. It's about involving people within the area so that they understand, they know, and they own the process and the outcome. So it's very much bottom-up and asset-based approach. So there's a lot going on in Scotland in terms of wellbeing economy initiatives. The middle bullet is the example I've just presented. We're in the process of setting up a Scottish National Development Bank. We are really focusing on digital connectivity across Scotland. because Scotland's quite a rural economy and digital is really important for enabling people to participate. We also have universal, we have a policy of universal childcare. We have focus on early years for children under 3. We still have free higher education, so no tuition fees. We have particular policies around inclusion, skills, enterprise that are really around driving improvements in the economy that benefit everyone. But I want to finish now with a slide around an initiative which we're involved in leading called the Wellbeing Economy Governments. And this is really about thinking about how we can take practical policy applications from one jurisdiction or country and share those with other like-minded countries who are interested in improving well-being through better economic outcomes. If you're interested, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock we have a seminar which I'll be joined with colleagues from Iceland and New Zealand, and Professor Stiglitz will discuss what we talk about. But essentially we've created a policy lab, and these areas of interest from natural capital, ecosystems, air, water, quality, which is really important to Scotland, inclusive growth, the framework I talked about there, wellbeing budgeting, which New Zealand are pioneering a lot of work on, performance frameworks, again this whole societal approach, which Iceland, Slovenia have been involved in, sustainable tourism, again something that's really important, which links to natural capital, and for the more government to government or the more techie type of things, we're interested in predictive analytics to look at the data to tell you how current policies will impact in people's well-being and welfare going forward, and how that links back into the sustainability of the economy, and finally child poverty. So that was a whistle-stop tour of well-being whole government frameworks in Scotland, and the slides will be available, and I hope you'll follow up and come to our session tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gary. If you're getting a rather annoying echo, apparently if you put in your translator, that's a good way of slightly reducing that. I'm delighted now to pass to Oliver, who has come down with a rather heavy cold, so go gently on him for his own well-being.
Thank you very much. I'm not representing a country, as was given in the introduction. Actually, I'm at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and I run what is called the African Center for Statistics. So basically what I'm going to be doing is give you a very broad perspective of what is going on the continent of Africa. Maybe as a start, just to mention that the issues about well-being or sustainable frameworks really are not things that we deal separately, as in terms of collecting data to actually be informed about the well-being of the citizens on the continent. But rather, this is data that is curated from different surveys, for instance, from DHS, including the census, where you actually include questions that will respond to issues of well-being. But I think with the coming of the SDGs, also that's given an opportunity to be able to have a better understanding about how people are responding to issues of well-being. So just to respond on the question of why should government be involved in the issues of well-being? I think first of all, what is very critical is to appreciate that every government's responsibility is to ensure that the citizens are made available, or the issues or the necessities that are made available to them in a manner that they're able to reach and be able to access those particular ones. And that's what is also what the SDGs is all about. It's about how can we provide the necessary information in the implementation. So the process of implementing the SDG itself also allows for citizens to be able to be informed on the well-being. But also, I think what is also critical that, despite the level of a country's advancement, whether a developed country or not, every country has a social responsibility to provide the required necessities and all the aspects to be able to inform them. So coming back to the question that she asked us, and who should be involved in the process of developing the well-being and sustainable development. In my view, these are 3 levels. At a global level, you have entities that have got what one would call a convening power or convening reach. The World Bank, OECD, for instance, the IMF, who are able to also produce documentation that allow for harmonization of processes and standards to be able to do that. And with that also, because they are guided by the available agenda at a global level, and that's one level. The second level is what one would call the regional entities. In case of Africa, we would have ourselves at the UNECA as part of the ones that will be able to have the convening power to bring countries together to discuss issues of sustainability and so forth. But more importantly, the third level is at national level. And there, that's why you find the National Statistical Offices being responsible, because they're the custodian, first of all statistical methodologies. They are able to guide the kind of issues that needs to be dealt with. They're able to identify the indicators that need to be developed. But they don't do it in isolation. They have to consult and work very closely with the other parties, the research institutions who have the capacity to develop methodologies, but also with the civil society and so forth. So that's, to me, it's at 3 levels in terms of parties who should actually be involved in developing the well-being framework in this regard. But the question that we asked was that how are these metrics used in policy decisions? First of all, I think the measurement of any well-being is an issue that refers to the assessment of the living conditions and the ordinary people experiencing their daily lives. But in terms of how these are done, is that, by developing these matrices, then it means that you need to develop the data or create data that is supposed to be available for evidence policy decision making. And to be able to inform. And I think the project that we've seen, at least what I've come to read about, the one that was done by OECD on policy coherence for sustainable development, is one such kind of a project that incorporates in a coherent manner the policy issues that are collected from there to be included in the policy framework. But I think there are 2 things exactly what actually goes on there. First of all, the matrices themselves, first of all, are allowed to achieve a recognition. In other words, are we able to identify the policy issues that would be able to answer to various issues that are being raised by the citizens? And I think the matrix provides for that. And the second part is that the matrix also allows to be able to forecast, to monitor over a period of time. This morning, somebody was saying, look, I don't believe really about being futurist, but again, you need an instrument that tells you what is like to happen in the future. And I think this matrix allows for that opportunity to be able to do that. On the question of how can the success of these frameworks be measured, first of all, it's an issue of having the right country assessment frameworks, which needs to be put in place. These are tools which will be allowed to assess whether the metrics themselves are working. And to have that kind of a metrics or an assessment tool, you need to have the right expertise of people that to be able to develop the metrics to inform whether the policies that are being put in place are working or not. Of course, in many instances, also in some of the surveys could be developed in such a way that they are able to allow to collect additional information to assess whether those policies that have been put in the metrics are actually working or not. So I think those are some of the things that I see. But I just want to go back a little bit to talk about how some of these things relate on the continent in Africa in particular. If I was asked today, do you want to undertake a survey to measure well-being with the resource constraints that one faces, and you have a choice that you either run an economic survey to inform the GDP or an informal sector survey to inform the GDP, or you run an independent project or a survey that will actually provide information on the well-being. The chances are that they will be opting to run a survey on the informal sector or an economic survey to be able to collect the information. Why is it so? First of all, is that the economic areas, very badly managed in the sense that there's no data that comes through to inform the GDP. And therefore, if the resources are made available, one would actually opt to have to collect the data to be able to inform GDP and so forth. So these are issues that we are considering to bring them into the fore, into the discussion, and to measure the well-being. And whether, even when we measure the well-being, the other question that comes to the fore is that when we talk about the GDP, which is basically an average, do people relate themselves to that GDP number? This morning someone was talking about if you have your GDP sort of 10,000 per capita, and say, look, I cannot relate myself to that GDP, it is your GDP. And that is very true. If citizens don't relate themselves to the number that you've produced, it becomes very, very difficult to relate, to actually see whether the welfare is actually improving or not. So really the question is that I think we need, in Africa, we need to devise or design new instruments that will complement economic survey and other surveys to be able to inform the issues of sustainable development or indeed the well-being frameworks. So those are challenges that we are faced with. And I think that learning from what we've heard, at least what I've heard from here, there are things that we can leapfrog on to be able to design perhaps instruments that will also be able to inform the citizens. Because one of the things that citizens are asking is that, is GDP enough to tell me that I'm doing well? If you ask my grandmother in the village, and I tell her, look, the GDP per capita for Zambia is, say, $3,000. And she said, I don't even understand what you're talking about, because I don't even have that. But if I was to ask her, do you think you're better off than your neighbor? My mother probably would be saying, no, I'm much better off than her, because it depends on how she has related herself. It's a very relative concept, and without really very concrete results or numbers to relate to, becomes very difficult, rather than just to leave them as issues that are dealt with very relatively. So I think that's what I would say at that for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Oliver. And just for the benefit of the timekeeper, I've given John a special extra 2 minutes because he's going to do a little well-being exercise.
Assignment, which is to run a short survey here. Are you happy? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. Now, to do this experiment properly, it has to be us singing and us clapping. Are you up for that? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, and you really want to show it, if you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. There are a lot of scientific reasons for doing that, but the main one was that I was offered another 2 minutes if I went through and did that, which I did. I sometimes then say, are you happier now than you were 2 minutes ago, in which the answer is usually yes, and then I go through a flourish about what well-being research tells you about things like choral activity and doing things together. And then I say, the kind of question I'm now going to be talking about is not the emotional question of are you happy right now. I'm going to advocate to you, because I'm going to be speaking primarily to the national statistical offices here. This is your conference. And I'm going to make a case to you that relatively easily you can build a big network of a statistical base about how good life is all over your countries, and I'll take you through a few things you could do if you had those in order to inform and make operational a full cross-government system. So I've given you the survey, and you're going to want to see me to the sidewalk, but let's go on with the details. These are the things that you can do, and I hope I'll prove it to you, or if you have good data about the quality of people's lives. And by that I really mean, and to answer Oliver's question before, it's quite right, you don't want another survey, you can't afford another survey, that's not the point. The life satisfaction question, Bhutan even puts it in the census, But essentially, you dump it in all your social surveys as one more question. The extra cost is essentially zero. The wider the range of surveys you include it in, then the better the cross-knitting you get across silos of the information, the more supporting data you can get about what actually leads to better lives. And the whole point of it all is it's a primary measure of how individuals are doing. And almost nothing else we collect with a single measure does that, and it does it comparably across all individuals. Secondly, this morning you will have noticed there was a discussion about, yes, collect a whole lot of well-being measures and then measure economic inequality. Well, what we've learned from having big samples of well-being data is that, in fact, much more important than the inequality of income is the inequality of well-being itself. And that makes sense. If, in fact, well-being is a better umbrella and a better measure of the quality of your life than your income, then the inequality of well-being also ought to be more important, and research is saying that's indeed the case. Well, of course, you can't have those measures of inequality unless you have the primary data. We never could have learned that income inequality is only a smaller part of that story had we not had these data. And fundamentally, and this is really important, when you have these data, you can find out how important other things are in common terms. And then you can take what you didn't know were comparable things like levels of health, exposure to unsafe environments, a level of trust in your workplace, and relate them to others, and you can do a cost-benefit analysis for various policies that brings what previously were footnotes about the social consequences right into the text and calculations, and it allows you to compare the value of projects right across government and over time. Finally, of course, and this is very important and where my examples will be going, is that if you have these data, and not just in a small survey, but from quite a lot of surveys, you can use them to get measures of the quality of life for all the demographies you're interested in and all the geographies you're interested in. And that enriches, of course, the kind of policies you can consider and what you get from them. Here's the first example. Of course, this is just drawn, as you may recognize, from the World Happiness Report. But the standard errors at the right show you that there's quite a lot of gradation among countries, and significant ones as you go from the top to the bottom. The colored bars are what you get from contributions, estimated contributions from each of 6 primary factors, determining about roughly 75% of the differences across countries and over time in average national levels of subjective well-being. You're used to seeing material support by GDP and healthy life expectancy. The other variables are hardly ever brought into the same analysis as the others. Social support, someone to count on, freedom to make life choices, generosity, and trust. Now, I'm going to give you some other examples here, and this is related to the trust question, which you noticed in the forward-looking version of the Stiglitz-Fitoussi version now, is trust is now widely recognized as being important. We presented a paper in Busan 9 years ago on trust and well-being, using the available data at the time to show that, in fact, trust is a first-order determinant of well-being. And one of these measures that is very important is what we call a positive measure of trust, or we can call it a positive measure of risk. It's a measure of empathy, which everybody has said is important. If you dropped your wallet, how likely do you think it is to be returned if it was found by, well, categories we use are a neighbor, a police officer, or a stranger. I'm going to concentrate on the neighbor results here because I'm going to talk about neighborhoods. All right, so this is with Canadian data of satisfaction with life. The whole population in the left bar, that's the average. People who have a low sense of belonging in their community and don't think their wallet would be returned if found by a neighbor have an average of 7.22. Well, that difference is 0.7, which is the equivalent of roughly a trebling of income if you compare it to the effects of other things. So the human social conditions in which you live are strikingly important. And of course, the people who have high belonging are up there at 8.1. To have high expected return of your wallet, 8.2. If you answer both of those, that you think your neighbors would pretty sure to return your wallet, and you feel you belong to your neighborhood, you're 8.3. So compared to the 7.2, it's more than a full point on that 10-point scale. Well, if we didn't have these data for these very large samples, I never could have told you that. And if that's not an important result, I'll quit. The next point on this geography is that, in fact, it's very different as you look across parts of a country where people live. So there's a lot of discussion about cities being unhappy places to live relative to rural areas, and this is true in Canada. It's not true everywhere. It's true in Canada. And as you can see, I'll give you some specific data on that, but you then ask, how likely is your wallet to be returned if found by a neighbor? Well, these are neighbors in both cases, and you can see in rural areas, it's very likely to be returned by 60% of the people compared to just over 40% in the cities. Well, given the power of that feeling of empathy about your neighbors, feeling about your neighbors that they're empathetic to you, is in fact very powerful, and it's the primary reason why people are happier in areas where they are lucky enough to have these warm and close contacts with the people among whom they live. So this is another way of looking at the geography from urban to rural. Average life satisfaction in Canada, this just is splitting the big cities versus all the rest, so it's against the towns and rural areas. So it's a little more than half the population are in this so-called urban amount, and the light blue is the other. You can see it's a pretty different situation for life satisfaction. It's materially higher in the rural areas than in the cities. Sense of belonging to the community much higher in the rural areas than the cities. Average income's lower in the rural areas than the cities. It doesn't mean that income doesn't matter. It just means that these other things matter so much more that they overpower those income differences. And here, I've been putting down life in cities, but only as a spur to action to make cities more like rural areas and the kind of social connections they permit you to have. The likelihood of returning a wallet if it was dropped, your wallet, if it was found by a stranger, the average survey answer in Canada is about 23%. Enough wallets were dropped in Toronto to show that there was an 80% chance of those wallets being returned. So that's telling you that people are much nicer to each other than we think they are. Well, that's an enormously important truth to learn, because your happiness is based on what you think other people will do, not what they actually do. And so if you're too pessimistic about the environment in which you live, you're being unhappy for no reason. Finally, not quite finally, but these are the differences among neighborhoods. That's another thing you can do if you have these big samples of data. You can dig into every city and find out which are the happy neighborhoods, and no surprise to you, the happy ones are the ones where people do feel an involvement with their neighbors. And you notice St. John's is the happiest, Montreal the happiest of the big cities, St. John's the happiest of all of those, but St. John's, I have to tell you, has 100,000 people in it, so it's quite unlike the several million populations of the others. Also, I've got an age effect here. That sense of belonging to the community, that's the red line. By age, this is, and this is showing a U shape in age, which is a regular finding of this and adjusting for everything else. And the blue is the people who have a low sense of belonging to their community. You see that that gap is huge. It's about 0.7 on the 10-point scale. But look at the end of life. It just widely grows. So it's almost a full point for the most aged groups, and you could imagine why that is. And it says if you're thinking about loneliness, the right time to do it is in those populations. I'm going to show you what happens. Another important question, one of the most important questions, and we focused on this a lot in the World Happiness Report in this year, was what happens to migrants. And so we started migrants from 70 countries going to Canada and the UK. same 70 countries, and then looked at the life satisfaction of immigrants from those countries in Canada and the UK relative to the life satisfaction in the countries they came from. So these are the ones that came from North America and Western Europe, and then we take the ones from Latin America and the Caribbean, just watch what's happening, and then the ones from Southern and Eastern Europe, and finally East and South Asia, not quite finally, and there's Africa. Well, you were hearing about the plight of migrants, but in fact you find that the spacing of those symbols is very close to those of the locally born, and the life satisfaction rises furthest. I'm getting very short of time. Here's in some sense a reworking of the slide I started with. How's my time, by the way? 1 minute, thank you. You see, I was given a bonus of 2 minutes, but it didn't go on the official clock. Now I'm into bonus time at this point. It's injury time, is that what they call it? So there it is. Obviously, I'm suggesting a very wide collection of these data in the cheapest possible way by adding them to standard surveys, reform cost-benefit analysis in the ways that these data permit, and hence you give this a central role, and you also can facilitate bottom-up happiness innovations. I'll be talking about that more in the morning. I don't have time to talk about it tonight. And then use something we call partnerships for happiness to informally bridge policymakers across the silo to make good things happen. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Paolo, over to you to tell us about what's happening in Mexico.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the OECD and the government of Korea for the invitation and the opportunity to present the experience of Morelos, which is a subnational level government in Mexico, where we implemented a framework of well-being with the assistance of the OECD from 2013 to this year. First of all, I want to give you a brief idea of Morelos. It's a small state, South Mexico City. It has around 2 million people. It has a relatively high score in the Human Capital Index. We have 70 years of life expectancy at birth, 9 years of schooling on average, but still 49% of the people live in poverty, and of those 6% live in extreme poverty. Even though economic growth has gone well in the last year, 4.7% of increase, still we have a lot of challenges to overcome. So the Wellbeing Project in Morelos started with the development of the State Development Plan, which is a mandate that all states have to do at the beginning of their administration, which is a 6-period government with no possibility of re-election. So for this, we carried out a wide citizen consultation process involving all sectors and stakeholders from the state with the objective to enrich the governor's campaign platform, which had been the improvement of human rights, granting human rights for all people in Morelos in order to improve well-being. In that time, we didn't know the well-being framework of the OECD, but still the approach was with a strong objective of improving well-being in all different areas and not only income. So when we did the State Development Plan, for the first time we included 72 indicators and goals for each one to be accomplished in this 6-year period. This was a huge innovation for my home state because statistics and technical information is not very commonly used for doing policy or evaluating policies. So at first, this was a good step forward, but when we started to work with the OECD in this framework, we saw that there were too many indicators, and it was not very easy to communicate or remember, and not all of them were as relevant for the specific priorities in the state. So we carried out some more consultation process with different sectors in the state to come up with a relevant set of indicators, which were at the end 20. So it was more manageable and easier to communicate, and the cabinet could learn them and really apply them into their everyday policy implementation process. And all of this was with the objective to improve the well-being and trying to accomplish the state development plan with all these metrics. So that's maybe why the National Statistic Institution in Mexico invited us to work with the OECD in this pilot project. So this framework could be shared with other states in Mexico and implement this framework for all subnational level with the same metrics, so it could be compared across states. So these are the steps we followed for the process. We started with a statistics analysis of all the indicators we had on well-being in Morelos. We continued with the consultation process with different sectors. Even the governor, the cabinet participated, all the education, the academics, environmentalists, the social sector, businessmen and women, social, and also safety and justice sectors. Afterwards, we came up with a pre-selection of indicators. There were around 20, and with the recommendations of the OECD, we perfected this selection, and then we communicate the results to all the stakeholders, and we came to the process of following up all these indicators once a year to see how things were going. And these are the list of the 5 priorities that we came up after this process. For Morelos, the most important dimensions were employment, health, safety, education, and income. And in this data I'm presenting, it's a comparison of all states of Mexico, ranking from the worst off to the better off in each of these dimensions. And Morelos ranked well in at least 4 of them, but 2 lagged behind of these priorities. It went well in education, employment, I can see from here, but it had very bad results in environment, income, and safety. Actually, we were surprised with the environmental quality indicator, where Morelos was in the worst position of the whole national states. And this was, the metric was air pollution, and we didn't use that metric. It was one that the OECD does for all regions in the OECD, and we were really surprised of these results, and we had a big discussion with the Ministry of Environment to try to find out what was going on and what policies we could implement to improve this area. So this is how Morelos looks like in comparison with all OECD regions, and still we have many dimensions in which we score below average of these regions, but some of them we score better in community, jobs, and also in life satisfaction. So it's interesting to see, even though in some indicators we are better off at the national level in terms relatively, when you compare to the international regions of the OECD, you see that you have a lot to do still in all of them. The experience of Morelos was the basis of the construction of a framework for all states in Mexico that After a process, we ended up with 37 indicators and 12 dimensions that are the same set of indicators for all the states, so we could have these cross-regional comparisons in these important topics. So how have we used these indicators? First of all, we had this annual evaluation of the State Development Plan, in which well-being indicators were included, and the results were presented in every year to the main stakeholders of the state that participated in the process, and also published in the state's website. Also, we carried out the evaluation of social programs by external academic institutions with a state evaluation commission of social development that was created in this period to really support the use of indicators to improve policies in a very specific way. Also, we carried out another project, which was the evaluation of the effectiveness of spending by implementing the results-based budget that included well-being indicators in program budgets. This was a challenge because normally budgets are managed like you only ask 5% more than the year before, and that's how most budgets, at least in Mexico, are done, and not many times are informed with indicators and results. It's only like the history is determining the budgets. So we really tried to implement the results-based budget, and this made a challenge of making better information with the administrative records, better quality of indicators, to have all program budgets with indicators and results that could be used for making decisions. And well, we have other examples to improve allocation of municipal resources for poverty reduction purposes. Also, this process helped us to elaborate our 2030 agenda for the ODS SDGs goals. For Morelos, with this basis of information, it was easier to come up with the priorities for Morelos and their indicators and goals. Now the challenge is the change in government and how all these results and all these advancements we had in the well-being agenda, we don't know how the new government is going to continue. So that's our experience.
So kia ora koutou. Hello everybody. I'm Susie Morrissey, and as Catherine described, we're going to tag team this afternoon with my colleague Alicia Hawkins. I'm just going to let you know the outline of what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk to you today about wellbeing indicators and policy frameworks in New Zealand. There are a number across the public sector, and we're going to give you a short outline of those. We're going to talk in detail about indicators Aotearoa New Zealand, and Alicia's going to cover both of those first two topic areas. Then I'll talk to you about Treasury's Living Standards Framework. I'll explain what it is and why we are using it, and then I'll also explain how the government's using it in the government's wellbeing budget, so that will just follow on from what you've heard there from Paula. So in the first case, I'm going to hand you over to Alicia. But I'm doing this slide. So this slide describes the number of wellbeing frameworks that we have got underway in New Zealand, so that you can see there a couple that relate to children, children's wellbeing and child poverty. You can also see there one that relates to the environment. You can then see the social report that talks about how our people are doing individually. And then you have the Treasury's Living Standards Framework. So you can see all of these different subject matter areas, if you like, with their own wellbeing frameworks. And you'll see on the other side there that they're informed by indicators Aotearoa New Zealand. That's our data source in large part. So we'll hear more about that, but that kind of sits as a provider of data for the ministries within the New Zealand government, and will also provide us with an opportunity to do some of our external reporting with respect to SDGs. We'll come to that. The point of all of these frameworks and all of this wellbeing focus all together means that our ministers have a wealth of information that they're able to use in terms of making their decisions, setting their priorities, and making decisions between different policies. And now I really am going to hand over to you.
So we were offered a couple of extra minutes if we did an interpretive dance, but we'll just stick to our 10 minutes. So I'm going to talk to you about Indicators Aotearoa in New Zealand. This is a project, as Susie just described, is about the data source that will support a bunch of other both local and international reporting requirements. So enabling us to report on the Sustainable Development Goals and supporting the Treasury in their work on the Living Standards Framework. This product is going to be a suite of about 100 indicators that will measure the progress of New Zealand. They will cover economic, social, environmental and cultural indicators. So how we're doing that. So I really wanted to focus on the first question we got around who should be involved in creating frameworks. So we selected the international framework, the Conference of European Statisticians' Recommendation for Measuring Sustainable Development, the CES as we like to call it. So this measures current and future wellbeing as well as the impact New Zealand is having on the rest of the world. We've adjusted it to make it fit the New Zealand context, and the most exciting part for me anyway in the development of this product has been about how we have really tried to work inclusively. We've tried to do a co-design approach. So we went out to New Zealand with this, saying, what does wellbeing mean to you? What matters most to you? We got quite high engagement for a really broad topic, and we were really happy with the way people engaged with us. So we did a bunch of different things. We had postcards that went out to schools. We did a bunch of face-to-face presentations, reached out to community groups, and we had an online poll as well. The key things, we're still processing all of that information at the moment, but the key things we heard that New Zealand cares about is health, and that includes a healthy environment, and people came up a lot as well, and their families. We have run a bunch of workshops just over the last month or so, and that went into, that was with a whole lot of technical and subject matter experts, and they were broken into the topic areas that are within our framework. And the purpose of those workshops were bringing together all of these experts to come up with a potential long list of indicators. So our goal is to get it down to 100, and the process that my team are currently going through is assessing against a suite of technical criteria and principles. The key ones that really stand out for me are about the fact that we're making this relevant to New Zealand, the fact that the indicators need to be outcome focused, and that it's not data driven. So we're not choosing the indicators based on what data is already available. We're saying what are the ideal things we want to measure in New Zealand. So that will mean that when we launch our product, there will be a bunch of data gaps as we need to go about filling that. The data also needs to be statistically sound, and one of the other key things that came up for us was about making sure that the data could be disaggregated. So communities want to be able to see themselves in the data so that they can do evidence-based decision making too. So our next step is about running an event next week where a couple of 100 people will come together to refine that long list of indicators down to a suite of 100. Every time I tell people this, they go, yeah, good luck. But again, it goes to being as inclusive as we can be and having all of those people in the room to help us with choosing the indicators so that the product will be used. Following on from that, we will be taking the information that comes out of that day and sending it out for peer review, both locally and internationally, and then launching our product in June next year. So I hope that what I have described in my bit that has taken way too long, is that I think we need to involve everyone in the process of determining a framework. We've really tried to involve citizens, government, academics, and researchers, and international best practice in our approach to choosing the indicators.
Thank you. Okay, so what was the Living Standards Framework that I so quickly referred to? Alicia's touched on some of this. She's talked about current and future well-being, and there's also aspects of risk and resilience. So I'm going to do the running speed tour of the Living Standards Framework, so I won't dwell on this too much. Let's crack right in. This is our Living Standards Framework. So you can see the three elements depicted up there. So at the top, you have current well-being, 12 domains of current well-being. You'll recognise 11 of them from the OECD's framework, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will spot the 12th that we've included, cultural identity. And we've included that so that we can include measures that speak to who we are as a country. We all think of ourselves as unique, and of course we all are. So we're going to capture some particular issues within our consideration for analysis and for measurement by the inclusion of that cultural identity domain. So you'll be familiar with those, I'm sure. Then we've got future well-being. We represent those through the 4 capitals. Some literature expands capitals, I know, to be greater, but we've condensed ours down to these 4: human, social, natural, financial, and physical. Financial and physical has a nice broad definition that captures things like innovation and intangible assets for those people who are wondering about knowledge capital. And with respect to cultural capital, we tend to think of that as very overarching, driving and influencing everything that we do. So we don't put it in perhaps social capital where you might think. We consider it to be something that informs and goes across all of them. Then the other thing you'll see off to the side there is risk and resilience. So what are the things that might impact our future well-being? What things might impact those stocks of capitals? How resilient are they to shocks? Shocks within the country. New Zealand, like many others on the Pacific Rim, we experience earthquakes, so things like that. But external shocks, another GFC or climate change. You'll also see there, just off to the side of the current well-being, we've included distribution. When we're thinking about how we're doing with respect to all of those areas, we can't just think about things on aggregate. We have to ask ourselves how we're doing for men and women, for younger and older people, for people who live in different parts of the country, elements that have all been touched on by my colleagues up here. So that essentially is the Living Standards Framework. We've been doing lots of work to try and make it as expansive and involved as we can, a different approach. We've kind of focused on some different particular areas based on our ethnic diversity within our multicultural society, but lots of work still to do. Speed tour through this. So we've had the Living Standards Framework for some time. We've been using it to analyse policy. What we haven't been able to do in the past is measure well-being using the Living Standards Framework. So this year we put together, we asked an independent expert to give us a proposal of what a dashboard might look like. We then consulted on that proposal, and we're putting our dashboard up within the next couple of weeks. I'll come back to that in a second. So then we'll be able to measure well-being, and we'll be able to advise governments on how we are looking. And I'll touch on that on the well-being budget in just a second. Ultimately, of course, decisions are always made by the government, but the more we can do in terms of both collecting data and analysing it and presenting it in a way that speaks to this broader concept of well-being, the better placed our ministers are to make those decisions. So the dashboard, so as I said, this is a new innovation for us. Everyone has been talking about how we need to do this measurement, and we'll have that together soon. It will have indicators for each of those 12 areas of current well-being and indicators for each of the 4 capitals. We'll use it to analyse policy, and we'll use it to inform the budget. So the priorities for the budget for this year have been set by using the Living Standards Framework, of seeing areas that we're doing so well and not so well, and then ministers have been able to set priorities using those. The budget priority statement will come out soon. You'll be able to see what those are, and then we should be able to see what happens in our first wellbeing budget. You might have heard of this. It's a national level budget. Next year's 2019 national budget will be informed from a wellbeing perspective. Priorities will have been set using the Living Standards framework to seeing what was good and bad, and the analysis of bids that come in from different ministries to determine where our spending takes place will be done using the Living Standards framework.
Thanks ever so much, Susie and Alicia. And as an Australian, I can't help but note that embedding wellbeing into policy making is yet another area where New Zealand is way better than their big cousin to the west. I've realised I've been terribly bad-mannered, and I forgot to introduce myself. So my name's Catherine Trebek, and I work for a very tiny new organisation called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And our mission is really to connect and amplify all the extraordinary work that is already being done to try and transform the economy into one that delivers human and ecological wellbeing. So thank you for having me. While you're collecting your thoughts and composing your questions, I'm going to be a little bit indulgent and throw a couple of mine back to the panel. No pressure to answer all of them, just pick which one you prefer. And I guess the first one is sparked by a lot of points made by Susie and Alicia around citizen involvement and participation. And so the question to the other panelists is, when and how would you envisage being able to involve citizens in shaping the wellbeing policy agenda? And then another question that I've been quite curious about for a long time, and it was reinforced this morning where we heard from the General Secretary of the OECD and from Her Royal Highness also about the importance of measuring or taking into account subject matters and issues that are probably really quite hard, if not impossible, to define and measure. Things like dignity and shame. And my question is really, if we can't get a decent proxy for something, is it better not to measure it at all? Or when is a proxy no longer good enough? And have you had any good experience about finding proxies? And perhaps for New Zealand, in terms of measuring cultural identity, it'd be good to hear how you're translating that. Because at one glance it might be seen as something quite intangible. How are you operationalising that? So we'll start from Gary and just go through, and then we'll get the roving mics running up and down the corridor.
Okay, thanks very much, Kathleen. I think you can hear me. So just on the citizens' involvement, I think there's a number of challenges you've got around that. The first is when you tend to go out for consultation on indicators, if you look who responds, it tends to be people that have got, I would say, at the higher income end of the distribution, who have got a direct interest. It tends to be civic groups or lobby groups. So what we found, particularly with our place-based economic development work, is you have to go out into the communities and you have to talk in language which they understand, and not typically the way that we would do civic engagement. So you've got to really think about how you engage people. In Scotland this year, it's the year of the young people, and we've had a programme of engagements specifically aimed at young people, including the Young People's Parliament, and involving young people in different ways and valuing them for future generations. So the civic engagement part is really, really important, but you have to get beyond the people that tend to respond to civic engagement. I'll leave some of the others to maybe pick up the other points.
Yeah. I'll pick on the first question about the involvement of the citizens. As I mentioned, we don't necessarily conduct specific surveys on well-being, but the way it's done in measuring well-being, it's the citizens are involved at various levels. First of all, it's at the design of the questionnaire. For instance, if you're running a household survey, it includes the civil society, NGOs, and other parties within the national statistical system that would be able to provide information to inform whatever survey that is going to be that's intended to. An example: if the intention is to develop a survey around demographic health surveys, it means that the stakeholders around that would be part of the design of the survey. But also at pilot, because then the purpose of the pilot is actually to see whether the questionnaire or the intended survey is going to respond to the issues that's being addressed. And during that process, it means that you are engaging citizens themselves to be able to find out whether those questions that are being asked are going to be relevant. But also, we have in a number of countries what is called constituencies. These are parliamentary kind of designed administrative boundaries where whoever is responsible for that constituency engages the citizens in discussing of what they would want to see from their own government, both at the constituency level as well as at the national level. So that's the process in which the engagement of the citizens are involved in ensuring that they can see themselves at some of those questions. They are responding to their own issues within their own communities.
On the first question, my answer is quite short: always and everywhere. And it's especially important to do so when you're thinking of alternative ways of designing and delivering government services. In the many examples we've studied, it's those ones that are coming from the bottom up that in fact almost always have more insight and innovation into them and always work better. And part of the reason is one of the big sources of happiness and continuity is in fact the feeling that it's your project, it's something that you are engaged in. And that's worth the price of admission. On the second point about the various emotions and how far do you go in that, I say slowly, but using the information you already have. So most of these things are raised in the context of how you might deliver a service differently. And the answer is then set up a small-scale operation and deliver it differently and check the emotions of people and, of course, their life evaluations under these alternative things, and you'll find out.
I just wanted to add an experience in Morelos. In the consultation process we did to identify the priorities for well-being. In the process, it was easier to talk about dimensions and how they came about in their everyday lives of people with the different actors and stakeholders. But when we try to talk about metrics and how to measure well-being results of policies, it was very difficult to get to people to propose indicators or to propose a result, a specific way of measuring a good result. So in that sense, I think there are some limitations on what you can get from people in the different stages of the process, but still we should try or make better methodologies to get the information we need from people and not get frustrated in the process. So that's one of the things that we learned in our process in Morelos. And in the other question, I have another question. In Morelos, what we had is some good results in safety. For example, the objective measures were saying we were better off in different indicators, but the perception of the people still was really bad, as if the government hadn't done anything. So the perception and the reality of things were really, really off. And I think we should get to see how we could measure better these objective measures and how people really feel about things, and so they don't think that the government doesn't do or doesn't pay attention to what their priorities are.
So, yes, public engagement. I mean, yes, I'm sure all agree that that's very important, and so we were really pleased to get lots of feedback of varying nature on our proposal for our dashboard when we put that up. So that was very encouraging. I think the question of proxies is an interesting one, isn't it? We want to be able to have all these conversations about these different areas, and the trade-off between having a conversation that's perhaps not as fully informed as you'd like it to be it is challenging. I guess, yeah, it depends. It has to be the answer. But I think one thing I would say is there is potentially a risk if you introduce proxies that you ignore the fact that you're missing something. So if you start to include another indicator as a proxy for something that you do think is important, the risk is that you don't do that work to fill that gap. And if it is a data gap, if you actually need to create a new data source, include an extra question in an existing data survey or some such, the risk that you might lose that opportunity by picking something else up as a proxy needs to be considered. The cultural identity question is very challenging. I mean, I'm sure any of your countries, if you start to look at this, will face the same challenges. Trying to define who you are as a people is not an easy task, not least because for the 5 million New Zealanders, you probably get 5 million, rightly so. So that's not an easy task. We will do some work on that over the coming year. I would say that, yeah, I think I need the 7th World Forum to be able to really answer that, unless Alicia might have something.
So I'll just touch a little bit more on the question around consultation and engagement. So I mentioned briefly that when we asked New Zealand, what does wellbeing mean to you, we had a whole lot of different mechanisms for asking those questions. So we went to small community groups, to the hard-to-reach population, and held little tiny workshops asking them, what does wellbeing mean to you? And I think that is one of the really positive ways of trying to broaden your scope of who does respond and whose voice you're hearing. Also, our postcards that went out to schools and retirement villages, libraries. So again, trying to bring a more dynamic response. In terms of the question around cultural indicators, that is definitely a tricky one. In New Zealand, there are a number of existing Māori wellbeing frameworks that exist already, and I think it's really important that we tap into that and we build our indicators Aotearoa New Zealand in as much of a co-design way as we can. But that is a real process of learning. We've developed a Māori advisory group to help support us with that. And in terms of your question about proxies, when we launch our product, there will be data gaps. There may be some proxies in ours to start with, but I agree that there's a risk in keeping proxies in there for too long. I think it risks people believing that their data is adequate, that it does tell the story you want it to do. So enabling filling those gaps with the right information as quickly as possible is important. Part of our process will be reporting back to Cabinet to say, this is what New Zealand told us they wanted us to measure. These are all the gaps that exist, and now we need a process for starting to fill those data gaps.
Okay, thank you. So, questions from the audience. Show of hands and roving mics. Do you all just want to get to dinner? There must be someone. I'll keep asking questions.
Yeah.
If you don't
Can
want.
I add another comment, Catherine, just to pick up on the consultation point? And I think my colleague talked about the hard-to-reach groups. In Scotland, we ran a consultation on a Fairer Scotland, and we went out to communities in the evenings, at weekends. We went to bingo halls, we went to clubs, and we facilitated a discussion. It was really difficult for the people doing it because obviously there was differences in the levels of empathy, but it takes a different type of conversation. I suppose the point I really want to make is when you do these types of engagements, you go there to listen. You don't have the answers, and you listen and take back what you hear. And that was really important. And some of the messages we got back from that consultation was people really valued being listening. The fact that the government came out to their area in an evening, a weekend, a different time. We even had our ministers going into people's houses who couldn't get out. So people take a lot out of how you do it. And that's what I was meaning earlier about if you do a standard consultation, most people won't respond. You'll get the type of responses you would get from people.
Okay, last chance to ask questions.
I just want to give
Otherwise, I'll keep going. Okay, brilliant. In the grey shirt here, at the back, keep backward.
one back.
In the right
Okay,
side.
it's coming down the aisle to you.
There's one to your right, behind
Okay,
Catherine.
just-
Hi.
No.
Hi. My name is Abba Saxena. I was earlier with WHO. And it's a very fascinating discussion, but most of the examples we've heard are from smaller countries, relatively small countries, or relatively small regions. And I'm just wondering if we have to duplicate this process in bigger countries, for example, like my country in India. It'll be a huge challenge, and each community will have a separate, different set of indicators that they would want, and how do we then make a composite indicator for the whole country? And there's a huge challenge for that. So I guess it's just a comment, but if there's any response.
Hold that thought, panel. I'll come to the gentleman just here.
Thank you very much. My name is Namo Kim from Korea, and I'd like to ask about how to make sure the governments are willing to adopt these the new well-being measures as their to measure success of policy, because as you mentioned in the case of Morello, there was a case that actually the security has gone up objectively, but the people were perceiving as not as that. So in that case, the policymaker would have some reluctance to adopt this new measure because there's some risk for them. So I would like to ask how you can make sure or make it more attractive for politicians and policymakers to do so. Thank you.
Before I go back to the panel, is there anyone else? Last
There's
shout.
one there.
Oh,
there,
sorry,
Catherine.
right. Beg your pardon.
Thank you. In relation to the issue of proxies, I noticed the answers were very positive and very confident about being able to fill the gaps, the data gaps. One reason, of course, you might go for proxies is because it's very hard to actually measure some of the things that you might want to. But in an era when not all countries are actually committing to national statistics agencies, that there's a move to, in fact, not fund censuses and so forth, or censi, whatever the right word is. That's a challenge. Now, New Zealand, I guess you're saying that in New Zealand you are confident that you'll have the funding on board to address all those data gaps and in the current framework, in a time when perhaps other countries might not have that same resource.
Thank you so much. So, in the interest of time, because our clock is ticking away, I'm going to ask the panel just to opt into maybe one of those three questions in whichever order you give me the nod in first. Paola?
Regarding the question of how to make this agenda more attractive to politicians, well, in that case of the safety indicator, having both indicators, objective and subjective, made us able to identify a problem. We were tackling the problem, but not the perception. And even though you don't use the well-being framework, you will have that reality. Maybe you still go and tackle the objective problem, but still the people is not evaluating you well, because something is happening and you need to investigate and identify why is the people so perceiving something that the other indicator is not reflecting. So I think if you have more information, you can make different policy decisions and to try to tackle what really is bothering or needing the population in order to have better results. And if you can have something to improve really the well-being of people, then politicians will be well evaluated and maybe winning next election. So I think the more information you have, you could design better policies.
Thank you. Okay. Oliver?
I just want to, on the comment from India, I think it would be difficult for a country like India, or even some of the big countries in Africa, to actually run a big program or a survey that will be able to inform well-being. My sense is that, especially after listening the whole of today and also reading the material that is available, my perception around well-being is rather different this time around, because I think the way I'm looking at it is that perhaps I need to go back and infuse the discussion with the national statistical offices and see how we could include questions in the already existing frameworks, the surveys that are already conducting, that will be able to inform that in the different areas within for well-being. That's how I would look at it. For instance, if we're talking about the 2020 round of census now. Can we include a few questions within the 2020 round that will inform well-being, especially that the citizens are asking questions around, is the GDP per capita really informing us about how well we are doing, or do we need a better tool to do that? So my sense is that perhaps we'll be looking at the questions that OECD has used and borrow what is applicable and have that as a complementary module within the census or a large survey, rather than having to go out for an independent survey altogether. Thank you.
Right, Gary.
Just to build on the earlier comments, I mean, for a National Statistical Office to do a set of statistics that apply across the whole country, so if you take India and essentially cover the whole territory, but let the states then boost the sample and add on questions so that you've got a core set of measures which you can compare the national and the sub-state, but it needs the national government really to invest in that and provide that core. In Scotland we benefit from the UK Office of National Statistics, which does UK-wide surveys, and we pay in addition to boost the samples and do what matters for Scotland. So I think that's really important. The other question about why governments use wellbeing measures, I think one way to think about it, most governments are signed up to the SDGs now. They'll have performance frameworks that show how they progress towards the SDGs, and there's a lot of wellbeing within that. So there's different mechanisms. In Scotland, we've used the Better Life Index as well to inform our inclusive growth work. So it's about taking what's there and adapting it to your own environment.
Okay, we've got 2 minutes, so really quickly.
If you want a strategic answer to the ministers, one is that in those sub-jurisdictions in countries where people are unhappy, those are the people who vote against the established government, and the effects of that are much greater than the effects of economic variables, always thought to be the things that determine elections. So people do care about the quality of their lives, and they're prepared to blame the current government if they're not so good.
So the question about the confidence of getting the funding to fill all the data gaps. So no, I don't have complete confidence that we will be able to fill all of those quickly either. But we do have a really strong commitment from our current government to, there's in the what's called our confidence and supply agreement between our Green Party and our Labour Party, there is a line in there that says a comprehensive suite of measures to measure New Zealand's progress. So I take confidence from that we have a government that is really committed to measuring wellbeing.
Brilliant. Susie, did you want to have? Okay. Well, thank you ever so much to our panel, to Gary, to Oliver, to John, to Paola, to Susie, and to Alicia. Thanks ever so much for attending and for those really good questions. And see you tomorrow. Thank you.